Most lenders fail before they even start because they don't understand the key fundamental differences in loan types. In the past year, I've done over $500,000 in revenue being able to decipher and break down exactly that. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I do that so that you can just copy me and avoid all the confusion. Now I'm going to start with the shortest term type of loan first, and that is your transactional loan. Now, a couple things to note about a transactional loan. This can be things like a double close. That might be how you've heard about it. Could be maybe you've heard the name Morby method, but here's the thing to note about a transactional loan. A transactional loan is going to be less than 24 hours. That's all it is. It's less than 24 hours. And that's the first very important thing for you to note, because that loan, although a lot of people might tell you, hey, I need a double closing, right? I need some transactional funding. Transactional loans are less than 24 hours. It's for the transaction only. Less than 24 hours, that's the first thing that you guys need to make sure you fully understand about this type of loan. Now, what else about these loans? Well, oftentimes they're going to be the full purchase price of a property. So what I'm getting to with that is that transactional loans are going to be a lot more money, right? There's going to be a lot more money required maybe compared to maybe some of the other things that we talk about later in this video. Transactional loans require a lot, and I will just say right off the bat that the typical charge for them, typical, not all the time, but typical, is going to be somewhere between 1 to 2% total. Now remember, 1 to 2% doesn't seem like that much, right? Well, the average, actually above average return of something like a longer term investment would be approximately 8 to 12%. And even if you're getting 12% annually, guess how much that is a month? 1%. And guess how much these loans make in under 24 hours? 1%, right? So pretty cool when you think about it overall, as long as you have the funds. We'll talk about all that stuff. So there's a couple things to note. Let me erase this and get to an actual breakdown for you guys of when this kind of lending would be needed. So in general, everything that we talk about when it comes to lending, we're working with real estate investors, right? This is not for people buying their personal homes, not for anything like that. We are working with real estate investors. So I'm going to run with this example throughout this video so that you guys can kind of keep it up there in the brain cells, but we're going to draw a little house here. And this house, oh yeah, best drawing ever. Person buying the house too, for sure. This house is going to be $500,000. All right? Now, that's going to be our example that we're going to run off of for this video for all the different lending types. $500,000 house. Now, there's a lot of different things that can happen with said house that might require you to lend on it. And what's important for you in this video is understanding what these lending types actually are, right? So that when people bring them up to you, when you're in conversation, you can be confident, you can be clear, you can be concise on what you're saying. So, example number one, we've got this $500,000 house. We've got this person right here. Who are they? Well, they're some sort of a real estate investor. Well, in this scenario, we are going to say that they are a wholesaler. I'm writing that kind of small. I'm going to write it bigger for you. They are a wholesaler. And what they do with this house is going to determine what kind of lending they might need from you. Now, in this example, we're going to be doing the transactional lending, right? The less than 24 hours style. Which means that what could be happening is that they're getting this house for $500,000, but they're selling it for $550,000. Boom. Which means that they are making plus $50K. But in order to do that, they might need to do a couple things. Now, one thing they could do is just assign the property, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But oftentimes they might do a transactional situation, which could be something like a double closing, right? Now, what is a double closing? Well, a double closing is where you have two contracts, right? Here's contract number one, drawn kind of sideways here. Here's contract number two, blah, blah, blah. It's a contract. Okay, so contract number one right here is going to be that $500,000 contract. And contract number two is going to be the $550,000 contract. Now, the question I get asked all the time, why might somebody do this? There's a ton of different reasons why somebody might do this. One of them might be they don't want anybody knowing that they're making $50,000. And so if you haven't seen, I break this down all the time, and I've got other videos that I can point you guys to where I talk about HUD statements, right? A HUD statement shows where all of the money goes in a real estate transaction. And if that HUD statement says the seller's gonna make, $1,000 and then they're like what is this line item that says you're making $50,000? Whoa, you may not want that, especially if you're an experienced wholesaler, you're trying to build a business, whatever it may be. You may not want people to see that. So instead, you can do a double closing, where you buy the property twice. There could also be other things like regulations in the state that you're working in. Maybe you're trying to transfer it into an LLC. There's all sorts of finicky things that are going on. But what you need to know is that a double closing has two contracts, right? You close, and then you close again. Makes sense. So the first contract is $500,000, second contract is $550,000. Now the big thing to know on a double closing, on a transactional deal, is that this money has to be come up with. You have to come up with $500,000. Now, I don't know about you guys watching this, but most people don't just have that sitting around in their pocket, right? So this is where a transactional lender would come into play, because this $500,000 is crucial to them being able to make the $50,000, right? So they got to get that money. So this is what happens. I'm kind of overcomplicating our board here. I'm gonna erase this stuff. So this is what happens. They need the 500K. So you send them the 500K. Now, immediately upon closing on the first transaction, you close the second one, which is another really important thing for you guys to understand. So we've got our first transaction, our second transaction. Sometimes people might come to you and say, hey, I need to do a double closing. I'm closing one, today, and I'm closing another one in two weeks. Well, what happens in that scenario? If you help them close this one, and this one isn't closing right after, then you might just end up buying a house cash. That's what's so important to understand. You're gonna have people come to you and say, it's a double closing. This video is for you to understand and define that that is not the case, right? That is not a double closing. A double closing happens simultaneously. You can look it up. Here, let's throw the definition of double closing up right here. We'll throw up the ChatGPT definition or something. It'll say within 24 hours or less than 24-hour period, right? So what happens is we're gonna buy this and we're gonna immediately sell for the $550,000. So I'm gonna lend this 500K and then I'm gonna add my fee, let's say 1.5% to that. And then when this second deal closes, for those of you who wonder where does the payment come from, it comes from that extra 50K, right? So when this deal closes, what's gonna happen is I lent the 500,000, right? We'll make like a pseudo HUD here. So I lent the 500,000, then I took a fee of, what would that be, 7.5 thousand. So I get these two things, and then the wholesaler is gonna get the rest of that, which is plus 42,500. Boom. Right? Wholesaler makes money, you make money, that's where the money comes from, and that's how a double closing works. So the important thing, and I break all of this down in the masterclass in more detail, but just as a high level overview for understanding double closing, the important thing is that it happens at the same time. It's less than 24 hours, it's typically going to be 1 to 2%, although it can go up, and select few people will do it for less than that like to race to the bottom. And that is how the double closing works. That is the only way that it works. Less than 24 hours, right? Now there are some variables that could come up, like for example, sometimes people might close at one title company and then do the second transaction at a second title company. You can still do stuff like that in the same day. Typically you're gonna charge a lot more because it's gonna be much more confusing, probably a little bit more risk involved, and more of a pain. The best case scenario is that you do it at the same place at the same time. When I fund transactions like this, we wire the money and we get in writing, signed by the title company, that they're gonna wire it back to us immediately upon receiving it. Immediately. Typically, it's less than 30 minutes. The only time really is that when you send money, it takes a little bit for the money to clear. Welcome to the world. So that is our first breakdown that we're gonna talk about. Now, after this one, right? So that's our shortest term loan, less than 24 hours. Now we're gonna bump it up a little bit and we're gonna go to our next type of loan. Let's check that out. Okay, now lending type number 2 is EMD. My bread and butter. I love breaking down EMD. It is how I got started in this business, and it is, in my opinion, the simplest way for you to get started in this business too. Let's talk about some basics of EMD, right? The first thing, when we're talking on our timeline, is that EMD is going to be approximately 30 days. Now, unlike the transactional, like the double closing, EMD is a completely different part of the transaction, although it's actually typically with the same type of person, right? So EMD is going to be what's getting put down on the contract. Again, I'm not going to be breaking down all the different types of lending in that sense today because it's all inside of the masterclass, but EMD is going to be approximately 30 days because that's typically how long you go from getting something under contract to closing. Now, just to be clear, some factors that may affect that are things like buying a larger property, right? Like a commercial property, a multifamily. Those can go anywhere from 30 days up to 60 to 90 days depending. But on average, most of what I do and most of what you'll see is going to be approximately 30-day timeline, right? Now, EMD has a wide variety of charges that people do depending on the deal, depending on the borrower, depending on their comfort levels. I typically see anything from 20 to 50% being charged on EMD. It's totally up to you. If you're using other people's money, then you got to use their rates. If you're using your money, you can use whatever the heck you want. But obviously, 20 to 50% in 30 days is pretty crazy, right? Which is why EMD is so cool. So let's break down this same $500,000 house example, but this time in the light of EMD, because again, a lot of you guys have heard people say, I need EMD, and it's not actually EMD. So let me draw our beautiful little house over here with our person, and it is a $500,000 house. Now, another thing to note is that EMD is typically going to be 1% of the purchase price. Right? 1% of the purchase price. So that is not always the case. If you are going direct to seller or your wholesaler is going direct to seller, it's oftentimes going to be way less than that. But typical on market is going to be around that 1% range, which would mean on this deal, your EMD would be $5,000. Now, EMD, of course, is so important because it's what validates a contract. It's what makes it legitimate. And so a wholesaler has to be able to get that EMD down in order to go have the ability to go make money, right? In this example, again, just like the last one, let's erase this and say that they're buying the house for $500,000, they're selling the house for $550,000, right? That means they're going to make that same $50,000 spread. So again, just like the last example, they have the ability to have extra money, right? They've got the money around, not that it's extra, but they have the money to pay you. That's where it comes from. But in order to get this under contract in the first place, they've got to get that $5,000 up and running, right? So what an EMD deal would look like would be that you would lend them that $5,000. You would charge a fee. Let's say in this case we use 40%, which is going to be the equivalent of $2,000. That means when the deal closes, you as the lender will make $7,000. And the way that they'll be able to pay you is that they're making $50,000 spread, right? And 7 of that $50,000 will go back to you. It will repay the EMD and it will repay that fee. A lot of times people get confused on how do you get it repaid? Where does the fee come from? That's how it works. Now, that is the simplicity of an EMD lending deal. There's a lot more when it comes to safety and contracts and all that, but I want you to understand in this video what makes it an EMD deal, right? An earnest money deposit deal. And here's what it is. I'm gonna erase the board so that I can make sure I emphasize this for you guys. The EMD portion of an EMD deal means that it never leaves escrow, right? It never leaves the title company. So when you go under contract on a deal, money goes to the title company to get the deal underway, right? To get things operational. When a deal closes, the money leaves the title company, right? The title company is done now. The money has left the title company and it goes to whoever the end buyer is, the seller. It gets dispersed, right? The money gets dispersed out. And so when you are lending on an EMD deal, like our $5,000 that we have, right? Where is that money going? Where's the $5,000 going? Every single time, this $5,000 is going to the title company, the title attorney, escrow, blah, 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 whatever. It's going to a third party, right? It is not going to the seller. It is not going to the wholesaler. It is not doing any of those things. So when you have an EMD request, how do you determine that it's EMD? Well, first off, they tell you it's EMD. That doesn't tell you that much. Second off, you check the contract, right? They should be giving you the contract. And on the contract, somewhere on there, on the Florida contract that I always see, it's like line 12, I think, section 2, something like that. It'll say something like a due diligence deposit, an earnest money deposit, something to those effects, right? And that's going to be right on the contract, and it's going to say that amount. So here's a couple examples. What if somebody says, oh, I don't need $5,000, I need $5,500. Well, in principle, that's fine, right? But we need to go look at the contract. And when we look at the contract, what we find is that there's $5,000 over here for EMD, and then there's an additional $500 for what they called, let's say what would they call this? Like a option, terrible O there, option fee, right? But the person just came to you and requested $5,500. This is, if you can get something out of this video, it is things like this. The requested amount, just because they requested EMD, does not make it EMD. You need to determine what the EMD is, because earnest money deposits can be refunded if the contracts are done correctly and if you do everything correctly. Fees cannot be refunded, right? So a fee might be paying a lender to do things, paying for an appraisal, paying the title company for something. In Texas, where I see this a lot, the option fee, you're paying the title company that option fee. What does that mean? It means you can't get the money back, right? So if I was to land on this deal and I got this $5,500, I would go back to them and say, hey, I checked out your contract. The EMD is $5,000, not $5,500. So I can fund that $5,000 for you if everything else checks out. But the $500, no chance, because that money is non-refundable. And even more important than understanding that it's non-refundable is just understanding that is not EMD, right? Like EMD fundamentally is the amount of money that you see on the contract for that due diligence. That is it. Any money that goes to anybody other than a title company, and any money that's not specifically listed on the contract as earnest money deposit, as the due diligence deposit, that is not EMD. You are going to get this brought up all the time. People will call anything EMD. They'll call the down payment on their house EMD. They'll call a double closing EMD. They'll be trying to flip a house and say, oh, I need EMD for 6 months. That's not EMD, right? What's our timeline? 30 days, right? So none of those things are an earnest money deposit. It has nothing to do with anything. You have to understand, earnest money deposits stay in escrow. They are clearly listed on the contract. They go to nobody except for the title company, and they don't include any of these random fees. It is a set number. It's not always a nice, pretty number like this, but it is a set number that doesn't change. So that is your breakdown of an earnest money deposit. This is probably the one that's going to be the most helpful to the most people watching this video, because you will get asked this question all the time. And simply put, you do not know what the EMD is until you look at the contract, and when you look at the contract, you will be able to determine what is EMD and what isn't, and then you can proceed from there. Lending type number 3, gap lending. Another crucial one for you to understand, not only what it is, but who is actually using it. Let's break down our good old classic example here of our $500,000 house, but this time with a twist. So we've got our $500,000 house here. When is gap lending going to come into play? Well, gap lending, by definition, is filling the gap between an existing loan or a first position loan or the first loan on a property and the rest of the money needed. Now, who would need something like that? Fix and flippers. Fix and flippers are who use gap lending. So in this example, our beautiful $500,000 house has turned into a crappy $500,000 house. It's a piece of crap. You got to redo the whole thing. We got to make it look pretty. So we've got a $500,000 house, and we're going to claim that this house is going to be worth $700,000 when all is said and done, right? That's all fine and dandy, but what needs to happen in order to do that? Well, you got to rehab the thing. And to rehab it, we're going to need an additional $100,000 to get it all fixed up, right? So $500,000 to purchase the house, and then an additional $100,000 to get it rehabbed and fixed up. Now that is what's so important, because we've got 500, we've got 100, so our total is what? 600,000, right? Now, there's a lot of different types of loans that people will bring in to fix and flip a property. Now, to be clear, I've never fixed and flipped a property, but I do know a lot of people who have, and I've worked with a lot of people who have, so I can at least explain to you how this works. Now, I'm going to use the example where you as a gap lender would actually come into play, and not the examples where you wouldn't be needed, because obviously that's not relevant. So, a hard money lender or an HML is somebody that can potentially come in and fund part of, sometimes all of, but for this example, part of a fix and flip. So let's say for standard simple math that a hard money lender is going to come in and they're going to fund 80% of the purchase price on this property, right? They're not willing to fund it all because that's a lot of leverage, but they're willing to fund 80% of the property. Well, if they're willing to fund 80%, multiply that by 80%, that's going to equal $400,000, right? So that's what they're willing to loan us. but you can see we need 600,000 total. So if we need 600,000, they're willing to do 400,000, then obviously that's going to leave us with 200K that we need to come up with. Boom. That is where a gap lender would come in, right? 400,000 has been funded. There's an additional 200,000 needed to get this property up and running, to get this thing flipped, and to get it worth that potential $700,000 at the end. So the gap lender would be funding this $200,000. Now, a couple things for us to note about a gap lending scenario. Get this erased. So just like we've been talking about with all the different loan types, first let's talk timeline. Typical timeline here is going to be 3 to 6 months. That is the average time that it takes for somebody to fix and flip a house. Now, can somebody fix and flip a house faster? Sure. Can it take you longer than 3 to 6 months? Definitely. It happens all the time, right? But this is our general structure. And so you can see we're continuing to work our way up, right? We started with the transactional deals less than 24 hours. EMD, 1 month up to potentially 3 months at a maximum. And now we're hitting 3 months at about our minimum and going to 6 months on average for this gap lending deal. Now, returns for gap lending deals, just like with most types of funding, is going to vary significantly. But what I see is approximately 50 to 30% per year. And sometimes way higher than that. They might even be doing 15 to 30% just for those 3 to 6 months, which would, double or quadruple for the year, depending on the scenario. But this is the basics here. And the big thing that I want you guys to understand about gap lending, besides the fact that as we tick up each lending type that we talk about in this video, you'll see what happens. Timeline goes up and returns go down. But the inverse is that as the timeline goes up, there's more opportunity. That's how it works, right? The less opportunity there is, the higher the demand, and you can get that better potential return. So 3 to 6 months is our timeline, 15 to 30% potentially on our returns. However, this is the first transaction we've talked about in this video that goes outside of escrow, right? So the double closing transaction, you work with the title company. It's in escrow. The EMD transaction, always title company, right? In escrow. Gap lending, not the case. You are no longer lending on the deal, just the deal on its own. You are now lending with an operator. What does that mean? It means you got to trust somebody. It means you've got to underwrite. It means you need a backup plan, because the reality is gap lending, you need plan A through Z, because if anything goes wrong, as long as you have things set up correctly, you're actually going to end up taking over this fix and flip. Now, do you want to lend on a property where you have to take over the fix and flip? For some people, the answer is yes. And when that is the case, they can be very successful because they take it over and they end up making more money. For a lot of people, the answer is absolutely not. They land on some fix and flip in the middle of nowhere in Florida in the woods. They thought it was way closer to a city than it actually is. And now they end up with this crappy house. They have no idea how to fix stuff. But because they lent on this gap loan, they've got a property, right? So the big thing to understand about gap loans is your timeline, but also the scenario in which it is actually needed, which I want to break down one more time just so we're superly clear here. So we have our $500,000 house, right? I'm going to put purchase price right there. Okay? Then we've got $100,000, which is our rehab budget. Now, of that $600,000 total, $400,000 is being funded by a hard money lender, which means that the gap lender would come up with $200,000. And gosh, I want to keep my math simple. Let's say they make 20% so that I don't have to blow my mind right now. That would mean that at the end of this deal, they would be getting back $240,000, right? Now, again, another easy thing you can do is figure out, is it possible to get paid the amount that you want to get paid? If you can't, you darn well know that this is not a deal you can do. So they're going to get paid their principal back, the $200,000, and they're going to get $40,000 in profit. But if you remember, in theory, this is whiteboard theory only. I know this is never how it ends up working out. The property was going to be worth $700,000, right? And so if they bought it for $500, they rehabbed for another $100, that's $600, and then they give an additional $40 to you, then they would still make a profit of $60,000 minus whatever other expenses come into the equation, right? So that is your gap lending scenario and breakdown. All right, lending type number 4, private money lending. This is the most vague type by far. So I'm just going to break down the basics for you guys. Now, private money lending objectively is exactly what it sounds like. It is lending private money. So I'm only going to be breaking it down specifically in the context of what a lot of you guys would know it as, because in theory, you could do a private money loan to your parents to go buy a new car. You could do it for a business. You could do it for a friend. Anytime that you are giving money to somebody else and expecting them to pay you back, it is a private money loan, right? So very, very vague terms. But in general, if we're looking at this $500,000 house example, one of the most common ways that you will see this used is when somebody wants you to lend them money longer term. That is the most common use of a private money loan. So to recap, we've done less than 24 hours for transactional loans. We've done approximately 30 days for EMD. We've done 3 to 6 months for gap lending. And now for private money loans, for reference, it's going to be 12 months plus on average. Okay? Now the other thing to note about these loans is that they're longer term, they're usually more protected, not always, but typically more protected, and my least favorite word, but the closest thing to this word of passive income would be something like this, where you're lending it out long term. It is still not passive, but we'll run with it. So just for easy math, we're gonna say that you can do 12% per year on a loan like this. The average numbers that I see, and this fluctuates by market, by person, all that good stuff, but 8 to 15%, I would say, is a decent range for a longer term, 1 year plus loan, right? Like a private money loan. So in our example with the $500,000 house, the way that a private money loan might come into play with something like that would be if somebody was buying a $500,000 house and it required 10% down. Now, in that scenario, you would take our $500,000 house, I'm just gonna erase this, we would do the 10% down loan, which would be 50 grand, right? And so they would essentially be asking you for 50 grand. That's what they would be asking you for. And they might say something like, hey, we want to borrow from you $50,000, we'll pay you 12% per year, and we want the money for the next 5 years. Now, what that means, quick math for you, is that you would make $500 a month, every month, for the next 5 years. And then again, this all comes down to very vague structure. You can do it however you want, but a general structure is that you would get that $500 a month, and then at the end of those 5 years, you would get your $50,000 back, right? That's a private money loan. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up as our fourth transaction type is that you guys can understand when you're in conversation, right? If somebody says, are you a private money lender? Do you do private money loans? What they are asking for, typically, you should always check with them, but what they are typically asking for is a longer term loan. So, a basic understanding for you guys of who is usually doing private money lending, it's people who don't have the time to find the higher leverage opportunities, right? So a typical private money lender might be somebody who's a full-time doctor, right? They got a full-time job. Hopefully they love their job. They're super busy. They're not actually interested in real estate. They just got money. And what they want to do is they want to give that money to somebody who took the time to learn how to buy real estate, who took the time to want to become an investor and deal with tenants and all that good stuff. And so they're going to be willing to invest with that person to make money on their money passively at a lower rate than the other things we've talked about today, but they don't have to do anything. So when somebody comes to you and asks, are you private money lending, or I need a private money loan, I'll tell you what I say first, which is no. But if you wanted to do it, just understand that this is what they're talking about, right? It's typically going to be a longer term thing. And another thing that I'll close this video out with is just saying, if somebody asks you for a private money loan, you can very easily look back at this video and figure out, okay, are we confused here? Is this a transactional loan? No. Is this EMD? No. Is this a gap funding scenario? No. If it's not those three things, it's a private money loan. They're looking for a longer term solution and they want you to be that very thing. So when you think about private money loans and hear about private money loans, just make sure you understand what they're asking. So you now have a detailed grasp of the 4 primary types of lending so that you can go with confidence and have conversations and bring deals in and know what the heck you're doing so that you can start building your business. To review, we talked about transactional lending, which is less than 24 hours. We've talked about EMD lending, which is typically 30 days. We've talked about gap lending, which is for fix and flippers and is typically 3 to 6 months. And then private money lending, which pretty much encompasses everything else and is longer term. Now that you have the basics, if you want to see my entire lending process, the entire transaction from start to finish, it just so happens I did a 4-hour masterclass from absolute zero to submitting a deal, getting it all the way to the finish line, and getting paid in detail, including contracts, processes, automations, and more. And it's all for free. So if you click the first link in the description right here, you can check that out, and I'll see you guys in the next video.